Hello, I'm Jamie Yuenger, and this is If You Knew Me, a podcast about the inner lives of women. Most weeks on this show, we walk into the heart and mind of one woman. That guest can choose to share her real name or to stay anonymous. Other weeks, we offer interview-based episodes with experts on themes that are relevant to women's lives. This week, we hear a story from Anne Zavorskas. That's her real name. Anne is 59 years old. That number is significant for her. For most of her life, she gave her sweat, blood, and tears to corporate America. At this moment, she finds herself at a crossroads. She's a few years away from retirement, but for Anne, this moment feels like a beginning. The question is, the beginning of what? Anne's story is entitled, I Sold My Soul to Corporate America.
If you knew me, you would know that I was always curious and an adventurer. But then I traced back to my childhood and I was thinking about where all this came from. Because right now, at my age, I'm 59. I thought I was 58, but then I did the math and I realized I was 59, which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But as a child, I was really thinking about how I've come full circle in my life. And it's been a very messy journey. And I think the podcast and being a newer listener of the podcast of If You Knew Me has been really instrumental. And I really believe that I am in the right place now in my life, but it's very messy because I'm trying to navigate. So what that means to me is looking at my childhood, I've been looking at the values growing up. And my parents really tried very hard to instill values that I could use, like a toolkit, if you will. But I just didn't know what they were doing when I was a kid. And I don't know that anyone does, but this is all obviously my story. So my father, for example, was an incredibly strong human being. He was one of the youngest survivors of the Holocaust. And he came to America having escaped a concentration camp. And he worked very hard when I was a little girl to not, quote unquote, mess me up. And being a child and his values and running through the woods and the Black Forest and trying to live literally and being deposited with farmers and all of that, it was really fascinating because they worked so hard not to mess myself and my brother up. And when I think about those values that he instilled, his big ones were to be strong and invincible. The simple things in life, because he didn't have clean underwear, he didn't have food, so for him, simplicity was just the way he lived his life. He'd walk down streets and dollar bills would accidentally fall out of his pockets, and he just didn't care about any of those things. And he tried really hard to kind of work with me the other way, ask why, be curious, and asking me all the time, who are you, Anne? Who are you? Who are you? And I'm like, I didn't know who the hell I was. I was on my own adventure, if you will, and trying to figure myself out. And I think what became so difficult is I had a brother who was born in 1965 and we lost him in 1976. So that was such a huge pivot for me, obviously. It was my only sibling. So people used to ask me, are you an only child? And I'd be like, well, no and yes now. But he passed away. And then my life really changed again. So my brother, he was diagnosed with leukemia, cancer. And he was 11 when he passed, and I was 14. And I remember the day he was having trouble breathing, and we lived north of Boston, and we knew that he had to go to the hospital, Boston Children's. We got in the car, and my mother was in the back seat with him. And he just kept saying, those were the days of happy days with with Henry Winkler and the Fonz, and my brother loved that. And she just kept saying, thumbs up, Stephen, thumbs up. And all the way to the hospital, she was just praying that he was going to make it. It was early in the morning and all the lights were turning red. And my mother just kept saying to my dad, go through it, go through it, go through it. And it was really traumatizing for me being in the hospital in the waiting room and my mom, her being with my brother and my dad in my brother's room. And he kept asking for me, but they didn't think it was a good idea for me to go say goodbye. So it was bad, and anyway, my aunt was there and she sort of cared for me. And I don't think my parents intentionally did that. They loved me, but they were trying to help me. It didn't help, but that's what they were trying to do. And anyway, she came out and told me he was going to die. And I just was like, okay, well, now what? Because I was an only child after that, I think I was always people-pleasing and really trying to make them happy. We had such an unhappy time, and it wasn't bad, but it was just hard. It was just really, really hard growing up like that. And my parents had trials and tribulations, but they started a publishing company in the garage of our house illegally. It was kind of funny, but it was one of the first publishing companies that they used typesetting, and typesetting meaning the first generation computers. So I lived through pre-web, Web 1, Web 2 in the garage with the external intercom system, telling me to clean the house. It was kind of funny. So anyway, they started there and they rebuilt that way. But it was really challenging. But I later found out that they had to declare bankruptcy because of all the bills with my brother. And we tried very hard to give him a life. We did traveling. We went abroad and we tried very hard to give him as much as possible. But my father really never could understand why my brother was sick, why my father made it to where he was, and my brother was dying. And my brother said, Daddy, only God knows. And for an 11-year-old to say that's pretty amazing. But those were my times. Those were my struggles. And I think that definitely embedded a sense of perhaps insecurity and always going the extra mile, always being prepared, always having sticky Post-it notes ready, always having the answer, which is good and bad. But I think now I realize that those things are critical, but I need to marry it all together. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to bring in those things to where I am now and fuse it all together to have a life and move forward in my life so I'm happy and not have these parts be disjointed. So bringing in my personality and my attributes and all of these things from my past to cohesively put myself together, if you will, so that I can move forward. Going through my childhood and after the loss of my brother, I really was trying to find something to keep me going. And I didn't know. I really didn't know, but I knew I loved to chat. I talked at a very young age. I didn't walk, which was a little alarming to my mother. I didn't really have a barometer. I was terrible in school. It was a real struggle. I was bullied. I was quiet. And I think what I found finally when my mother asked me what I wanted to do, I said, I just want to do theater. And so that was my first really pivot, again, in my personal life. And it was a survival thing, but it ended up that I loved it. I was good at it. I did, summer stock. By the time I left high school, I really became something in school, if you will. I was suddenly the popular person for my last year or my last 2 years because I found drama and I could show people who I was and what I was made of. And for me, that was an incredibly pivotal point. And I went to college for theater. I did 4 years of college, still a very bad student. In fact, I was looking at some of my old grades and I'm like, oh my God, I can't even believe I graduated. And I graduated college, and somehow when I left Syracuse, I was crazy and I lived with two girls. And I went into Manhattan, no money. I slept on a fold-out chair. I didn't even have a bed. And I started a new journey. I knew somehow that I was done with theater and I was on to something next. I always followed the path of my parents, do this, go to college, here are the steps to have a successful life. And I did those things. I did those things until this past summer. And I realized, you know what? This just is not working. I have taken jobs for the money, to have an income, to do all those things that people are telling me. And yet it was incredibly frustrating. And there were a number of different points in my life that I felt frustrated and just questioning why people weren't seeing the real me, which I have all these great attributes. I go above 100%. I sell my soul to corporate America, and I'm not recognized. And then coupled with the fact of taking my last 3 jobs and not being appreciated in the sense of even a thank you, and deciding to move on and have companies not even recognize me, did send me in a tailspin. And coming home, crying, screaming like I was not rational was not good. And what's really interesting is the dynamic with my spouse, who is a little bit older than me, but has, especially during the pandemic, has done a lot better. And he has managed to find jobs that fit him. And he's on the other side of a 1-floor house, and he's in his world with his, talking to his colleagues and having the job that he likes, although he went through some challenges as well. But my side of the house, I'm frustrated and I'm upset. And there's this crazy dynamic with the two of us. And I think that my life has always been that way. I've always had, when I look back, I've always worked so hard for what I have. And it's so frustrating to not have those things. And I love the movies, and I love to put my feet up and watch Lifetime all day. And I want to just do that, So it's been hard, and now I'm at this crossroads, and I'm looking ahead going, okay, well, what the hell am I going to do now? And I'm working really hard at that. Every day I sit at my desk, I have my sticky Post-its of my attributes. And that's a crisis for me, because I try not to think about my age, and I joke about that, but I forget, because I try to block that part out, because I'm just focusing on myself, which is a good thing now, because I never could do that before. And when I think about my father, I lost him. He took his own life. So that was an incredibly difficult time for me. And when I think about that now, it's been many years now, 15 years, 20 years. That was the one time I needed therapy. And I think about that time when that happened. And I look back in my journals and I think about how hard that was. And the fact that I was hearing voices in my head, which I knew wasn't good, like screaming voices because of the stress of that loss. That's been a whole nother thing, because we were so close, but I didn't know that he was struggling with mental illness at that time. And I just didn't know. And do you really know someone? So did I really know him just as he knew me? And that was, I think, the turning point. But after he passed and I went to therapy, I am my father's daughter in that I scream and yell and carry on. But that's the way I work through something. And the therapist said, Anne, do you think you might need medication? Not just to help me, because I was just beyond anything. And I said, no. I said, let me go home if I'm still this way. Next session, we'll go that route. And I went back and I was better. I just needed to scream and yell and do whatever I needed to do. So my father passed, and after that, it was just horrible. And I was sort of forced to work because we were trying to keep a home in Connecticut. And I just was a bit of a ghost. And I just went through hanging over my desk, literally, just for a paycheck. And I was doing that over and over again. And finally, we ended up selling our house in Connecticut, moved to Florida, and stayed with my mom a while. And slowly I reinvented my life. And I did it by just the survival skill, like putting one foot in front of the other. I had no intention of leaving this life. I made a choice every day to show up. And that's what I did. And I just started rebuilding. But the career thing, I always thought I would arrive, quote unquote, by doing what others said. And I just didn't. And I've been at this crossroads before, but I've just not had the opportunity to really look at my life until now and really think about what I want to do. What's in front of me right now is hope. I realize, finally, that I have all these things I can do, and I want and need to do something that's going to fulfill me, and own me. And that's the biggest thing. So what I've been doing is looking at what I'm good at, looking at some of the stuff that, even going back to childhood, those values and attributes, and organizing them. And I'm a visual person, so I have a mini whiteboard with 3 columns. I call them runways. And runway 1 is the dark, scary tunnel, which is corporate America, because I do need a paycheck at some point. Runway 2 is freelance. It's kind of going, but focused in what I enjoy doing in the marketing area. And runway 3 is really where I want to be, which is going back into publishing, because my family started in publishing and doing self-publishing and working on my dad's story and getting that in print as self-publishing. My mom wrote this book about him. So trying to work on that project. So those are the 3 things that I'm working on, which is messy because sometimes runway 1 is, right now it's dormant. So I don't have to worry about runway 1, which is going back to dark, scary corporate America. But I'm working on runway 2 and 3, and I'm in the thick of it now. Even though I have support and I have a certain amount of time and we're good, it's still scary to me. And that's what I'm afraid of. The dark, scary place is going backwards and having to take a job that I did when my dad passed away and I didn't have a choice. And I don't like going backwards in my life as far as occupation. So for example, in this case, being an administrative assistant or working in a restaurant or just going backwards and doing something that I've done in the past, that scares the crap out of me because that to me means I failed. However, the runway I really want to be on is runway 3, which is publishing. And I really want to finish my learning to get this first book out. I want to write a book of my own then and now. I want to do public speaking against hatred. So I'm sort of focused a little bit on that in Runway 3 and building my own future and my own business so I can do those things that I love. And I love the idea of telling stories and self-publishing and helping people tell their story. I want to tell my own story, which is going to fulfill me, and I have a few of them, but also helping others tell their stories. And that's really where I want to be. So the full bloom picture for me would be to take on projects that I'm passionate about, one of which would be in the publishing sector and telling stories and building out story publications, but learning about publishing again. I'm making a full circle, really, because I started in the garage with my parents learning about publishing. I ran around and did a whole bunch of other things. And now I'm coming back to my attributes of what I love. And I'm good at it. And that's what I enjoy. And it brings me happiness. And telling stories and being able to publish my own stories, other stories that are important to me from other people, and helping them maybe market those things for income. But then also working on my legacy. I don't have kids, so working on what that means to me. And for me, history repeating itself. I'm reading a book called 21 Lessons in the 21st Century. And it's really scary because when I'm reading this book, I see that history is repeating itself in a lot of ways. And how am I going to help the next generation remember things, these horrific things that have happened in our past? The persecution against different types of people, different peoples, which is just wrong. The fact that we're wiping out parts of history in history books is wrong to me. And I want to make sure that my dad's story, for example, just as one example, is remembered because I won't be here forever and I don't have a lineage there. And that's really important to me. And that's my passion project. And whether that means aligning with a speaking tour, I'll do it. Whether it means, being on more podcasts, I'll do it. But whatever those things is using my own experience that history does repeat itself and we need to remember these things. I don't want people to lose their way. And I want to give someone the values and attributes that I have and tell them, be flexible, be adaptive and adoptive, learn more than one thing, because you're going to have to reinvent yourself more than once. So the youth of tomorrow and working on that, which I really love. So that's the other part of my picture. I'd say the big thing is I'm deserving. I deserve what I've worked for and what I'm working towards. That's the biggest thing for me. And I'll get there. I will keep going and get there because I do deserve it and I'm going to enjoy it and I'm trying to enjoy every day. But the fact that I deserve to be happy and owning that is really important because sometimes I feel I don't, and that's not right.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode. Anne Zavorskas lives in Charlotte, North Carolina with her husband. Her great hope is to explore self-publishing and storytelling as a way to tell her family's stories and to help future generations. If this is your first time listening, we're so glad to have you with us. Definitely check out the earlier episodes. Every story is different. Also, I wanted to let you know that we just switched the frequency of our newsletter from once a week to once a month. Piet and I are constantly thinking about how we can build real connection and reduce the noise. So we're lowering the frequency, but upping the quality. The new newsletter will include a short letter from me where I'll share my reflections on the 4 episodes from that month and how they relate to bigger themes going on in the world. It's designed as a pause or a moment of self-care where you can step aside from the hustle and bustle of your daily life and sink into deeper themes that matter. So if you'd like to hear from us, this is a great time to sign up. See the link in the show notes. And if you've been listening for a minute, you must appreciate our mission of documenting and publishing women's real stories. So if you're moved, I invite you to support the If You Knew Me initiative. We produce this podcast, but we're also working on a large format book project about women's inner lives. The book will share women's stories from this podcast alongside stunning photographs. When you support the initiative, you can join us on our journey of creating this show as well as the upcoming book. So if you believe in us, please go to the show notes and find the link to become a supporter. This podcast is produced by me, Jamie Yuenger, and my husband, Piet Hurkmans. Thanks so much for listening to If You Knew Me. We'll be back with you next week.